Okay, we are going to wrap up our speaker list this afternoon with Patrick Lynn. And Patrick is an associate professor in the philosophy department here at Cal Poly. He is the director of the Ethics and Emerging Sciences Group and teaches courses in ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of technology, and philosophy of law. He is also the author of Robot Ethics and is recognized internationally for his work in nanotechnology, human enhancement, robotics, military technologies, and other areas. Please welcome Patrick Lynn.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Mary, for inviting me here. Let's see if I can figure this out. Okay, so since this is a Polytechnic campus and one of the best in the world, I think we would be remiss to not look at the link between what we're talking about today and technology. So these are really, as a sneak peek of what I'm going to be talking about, we'll be focusing on three areas: identity, truth, and money. And the reason I'm here is that I'm an outsider. I'm not a journalist. So I was invited here to give kind of an outsider's perspective or a philosopher's perspective on this conversation about ethics. And so what I'm talking about today isn't really my bread and butter issue. So this is very much a work in progress. I appreciate any feedback. I do technology ethics, so I'm going to comment mostly on that link. I'll try not to echo too much, and as my job as a philosopher, I'm going to try to challenge and to provoke and maybe make some of you angry. So that's part of my goal today. Now, I'm not a journalist, but I have worked quite a bit with and in media. It started with working in my high school newspaper, and when I was at Berkeley, I flirted with the idea of being a journalism major, but I ended up choosing the more leisurely and financially lucrative life of a philosopher. In a previous life, after my PhD, but before I came to Cal Poly, I actually worked in public affairs and public relations in Silicon Valley. And even in academia in the last few years, I've written about 20 contributed articles for national pubs like Slate, The Atlantic, Wired, Forbes, and others. So I know a little bit about journalism. The first thing I would say is I think journalism has an identity crisis, and I don't think you would disagree. One question we can ask, as a philosopher, we like to ask definitional questions. We can ask, what is a journalist? And I think this is tied to the question, what is news? And it gets complicated here. So the landscape is filled with traditional media that is moving towards the edges of, moving towards partisan edges on both sides. You have blogs like Huffington Post, Daily Kos, social networks, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, other platforms. You have aggregators like Reddit, Yahoo News, Google News, automated and curated links. You have infotainment, thinking, Jon Stewart, Colbert, John Oliver, and then you have other people. You have people like me. I don't know where I would fit in. I'm an academic who happens to write for some publications. And this is an important question. What is a journalist has implications for law, for ethics, and for society. So one example of a legal implication is if you're a journalist, you'd be entitled to media shield laws. You wouldn't have to reveal your sources, but bloggers might not have to. So it really matters who counts as a journalist. In ethics, depending on what profession you're really in determines which ethical code you ought to follow. I'll talk more about that in a sec. And a social implication is that I think journalism is essential for an educated citizenry, educated public. And an educated public depends on media, but to do that, they need to trust media. So another example of a legal implication, in Europe, it matters a lot if you're counted as a media organization or not. If you're not, if you're someone like Google, who counts themselves as a data controller, not a media organization, then you're subject to the right to be forgotten law that was recently passed in the EU, meaning by law, you must take down irrelevant information or irrelevant links if someone complains. So if a person had a bankruptcy 10 years ago and it's not really relevant now, it's been solved, if someone searches for this person's name, the bankruptcy might come up, and they don't like that. So in Europe, they look at freedom of information and privacy a little differently. This trend might someday extend to actual media. It might actually come across the pond and affect us here in the US. Another example of ethical issue is this. So different professions have different norms. People like not just academics, but say computer security specialists, hackers also publish in the media. They find a vulnerability and they want everyone to know about it. They want the scoop, right? Just like everybody else, whether it's philosophy or journalism. But hackers actually have a code of ethics. If you're a white hat hacker, if you're a good guy hacker, it's your obligation to report the vulnerability to that company first, give them a chance to fix the vulnerability, fix the hole. And if they don't after some period of time, then you can release that information, then you can publish it. And Karen alluded to this, I think, a little bit with the no surprise journalism. So I think there's an analogy here between that and whistleblowing and government watchdogging too. So I mean, we could ask, is it unethical to not let governments, to not give governments and other organizations a chance to fix their mistakes first? Is there an obligation to keep quiet for a little while? You know, is that what ethical journalism means? And trust is critical, as many people pointed out. I'm thinking about Judy and Rob Logan's talks. So trust is critical. A lack of trust could be a public health hazard, right? So think about the current Ebola, quote-unquote outbreak and other events. Trust is also needed to be a government watchdog. And I think it's a legitimate question whether that role is actually still needed, given the information economy we have out there. Now, trust, the second topic, trust is tied to ethics, which is tied to the pursuit of truth. We heard a lot about truth. We heard Dale and Peter talked about finding the right word, and I think we found the right word here with truth. But the question is, what exactly does it mean? Does truth mean what we think it means? Robert talked about how truth is tied to evidence and context, and that makes it very, very complex. I think if you look at most journalism codes of ethics, one of the very first things they say is something about truth. Seek truth and report it. Journalism's first obligation is to the truth. Our purpose is to pursue the truth. And in our technology-powered world today, a lot of the truth, a lot of the story is buried in the data. Data really is now the coin of the realm in this 21st century. As Google would say, in God we trust, all others must bring data. So data is very, very important, but this brings challenges to uncovering the truth. I would suggest that truth, if you think of truth and some disinterested, objective, neutral perspective as being related, I would challenge that, whether we really could have that, if we really could have objectivity. And I'm aware Peter and David and others alluded to this multi-sided facet of truth, and objectivity isn't related to truth. But I want to suggest this. I mean, we could look at philosophy. An Irish philosopher, George Berkeley, suggests that it's impossible for us to really be objective, to be perspectiveless, to have no point of view. So right now, imagine this room, except imagine there's no one in it. Okay, imagine no human beings in this room, no one's looking at it. I mean, close your eyes and just try to imagine this room. Can you do it? No, you can't. What you're doing is you're imagining an empty room, but you're slipping in perspective. You might be some disembodied perspective floating in the corner of the ceiling looking down at the room, but what you've done is you slipped perspective back in there. It seems impossible for us to imagine something without having some kind of perspective built in. And this is something like the quantum physics paradox that was mentioned earlier. Once you observe a quantum particle, you change its position. So I think the truth is something that requires a point of view, but a point of view is inherently biased. Let me give you an example. So I work a lot with robot cars. I was on sabbatical at Stanford all last year working with the robot cars people and meeting with Google and Tesla and others. And here's a fairly simple scenario. I want you to tell me what the truth is here. So currently, the fatality rate in traffic accidents in the U.S. is about 33,000 people a year. So that's about 1 every 20 minutes. Someone dies from a car accident. And robot cars are meant to, they're widely predicted to slash this fatality rate, by half or even more. Okay, but let's say it can do that. Let's say robot cars slash the fatality rate by half. What does the headline say? Do we say robot cars save 16,000 lives? or do we say that robot cars killed 16,000 people, right? So both may be correct according to the data, but which perspective do we go? I mean, so I'm reminded of Judy Muller's talk about the three little pigs story, that, you know, the truth is often more complicated. And the problem here, I think, is this. When you talk about data, torture numbers, they'll confess to anything, right? So Greg Easterbrook, a writer and editor, said this. And the problem of extracting stories and the truth from data is just that. I mean, stories are often wrapped up in social context and some human writer's perspective. This is a problem because so much of our news, or increasing amount of our news, is coming through algorithms, coming through AI or machines. They're not curated by human beings. They're processed by machines. Pew Research found out 30% of U.S. adults get their news on Facebook. So not only do we get stories from data, but we see certain stories based on our behavioral data and secret algorithms from these platforms or news aggregators. And there may be some hard-coded biases in the algorithms that affect the kinds of news we see. And by the way, they also affect the kinds of relationships you develop on your social networks. If someone's news comes up more than others, then you're going to naturally have a stronger relationship with that person. So Facebook is controlling your friendships as well as news. This is related to confirmation bias. If you see a lot of news that confirms or agree with your beliefs, you're going to think you're right. And you're going to think that's all that's important. And it reinforces our beliefs, I think, for better or worse. Let me shift gears a tiny bit here. We're still talking about the truth, but tell me what these three things have in common. I don't know if you could read it from that far. Can you guys see this? Okay, let me read it quickly. So reliever Darren Oliver got the win for Los Angeles. He allowed no runs over 1/3 of an inning. The Los Angeles lefty struck out none, walked none, and surrendered no hits. Second story. While the overall tone of Gingrich's tweets is positive, public opinion regarding the candidate and character issues is trending negatively. In particular, @Mommy Vickers says, someone needs to put the blood-armed, suspicious character to a photo montage with Newt Gingrich, /pimp. The Walt Disney Company reported a 33% increase in its fiscal first year net income, beating analyst estimates, blah, 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 blah. So what do you think these three stories have in common? Anyone want to shout it out? They were written by computers. They're written by artificial intelligence, sometimes called robot reporters. And they're taking all our jobs, obviously. I don't want to harp on that point, and that could be good or it could be bad. There are several companies leading this effort. Narrative Science is one, Automated Insights. These machines can write financial stories by quickly digesting a complicated, thick annual report and pulling out certain information and connections. They could write sports stories from statistics. They could tell a story from a winner's perspective, or a loser's perspective, or some neutral perspective. And this shows, I think, an inherent spin to a story. Again, the myth of objectivity. And any of these spins could be appropriate, right? There are many different ways of telling a story, depending on the readership. But I think if we're insisting on truth or objectivity, then we might need to know something about programming, computer science, if a lot of our news is being curated or processed through machines. And I think what's troubling about this trend is that there's certain things that AI cannot do. So machine learning and computers, they're really good at finding correlations, pretty bad at finding causations. You probably can't see this graph. This graph has two curves, and they closely mirror each other. One is, let's see, what is this? One curve shows the number of government space launches across the last several years. The other curve shows the number of sociology PhDs. So if you were a dumb machine, you would think, wow, there's some very close correlation here, potentially causation, but a human being can easily figure out that it's not. There are other graphs that show that, for instance, road fatalities in the US go down as imports of Mexican lemons go up, right? Very close correlation, probably zero causation. Machines also can't make broader links with other news. So the context that Robert talked about, and others had talked about. They can't find an odd piece of information buried deep in a financial report and say, wait a minute, we need to stop and investigate this finding. I'm also worried that, I mean, it's true that there aren't any, no one's sending reporters to cover Little League games, right? So maybe robots aren't taking our jobs that way. But nonetheless, it seems that Cub reporters are losing important experiences. If you become a senior reporter, you're going to need to have command of a company's history or financial performance or an athletic team's history or some athlete's history. And you can't get that without slogging through really difficult financial reports, annual reports, and have some kind of memory about that over time. There's really no shortcut for us to do that, short of downloading information directly into our brains. Speaking of robots, another technology to help uncover the truth is drones, so flying drones and ground drones. And they raise the usual issues about privacy versus public interest, trespass issues, the right to know. If you're worried about the surveillance state and loss of privacy, then this trend seems to make it worse. I mean, we can watch the watchers, but that just means that everyone's being watched by everyone else. And as Peter King mentioned, that this, everyone's behavior changes when they know that they're being watched. MIT has a cute little robot called, I think it's called Boxy, and it's cute on purpose in order to make people open up and tell their stories and reveal personal information. This sounds deceptive to some people. It sounds like you're hacking into the human mind. You're manipulating people with engineering design. So some more ethical issues there. So the truth, I think, the stories we get are also affected by editorial decisions. There's a familiar complaint that there's too much negative news, right? That this, again, leads to some confirmation bias that the world sucks. There's also self-imposed limits. Karen mentioned or addressed the Islamic State beheadings, and earlier there was a controversy about whether we should be publishing the Ebola patient's name and address. So some of this is related to technology and the availability of information. It causes us to make more decisions about what to publish. I want to suggest that it's possible to have too much truth. And this is related to the rise of citizen journalists, blogs, other quasi-media, CNN iReports, and such. There's a disturbing trend, I think, of quoting the internet. Really? Do I really want to hear what some idiot in BFE has to say about this topic as opposed to an actual expert? And I think they talked about commenting policy. Publications such as Popular Science have just turned off their comment policy, and I actually try to do that in some of the articles I write, because frankly, they've never been of any value to me, and trolls seem to ruin this democratic conversation we're trying to have about current events. I know a lot of media, they've moved their commenting features to Facebook, but Facebook requires real names, so it's unclear whether that has a chilling effect on conversations. Okay, last topic, money. So the pursuit of truth and commitment to these high ethical standards are affected by resources, and resources depend on revenue, which still seem to be in decline. It's a tough situation for sure. We talked about an increasing competition, whether it's perceived or real. People don't know, or generally, legitimate media from bloggers, from platforms, from infotainment. Same time, this also means that profits are going down, revenue's going down. Craigslist is one of the big reasons, right? They've killed off the classified pages. Pew Research found out that media today count on advertising for more than 2/3 of their revenue. But it's a really tough situation. It doesn't help that the public wants and expects content for free. Karen mentioned something about, being quick with the news and being truthful aren't incompatible. And it reminds me of something, a familiar saying in business. In business, they say, well, if you have a product or service, you can offer your customers 3 things. You can offer it fast, cheap, or good, or high quality. Now, the trick is you can only pick 2 of those. You can't have all 3. So So there's a lot of pressure, and some of it's unfair. I don't know what the solution is here. Industry just needs to get really creative beyond, I think, online subscriptions and pop-up ads. They need to add value that others can't provide, and I'll return to this in a moment with a suggestion. Money means getting readers. In some ways, seem tricky, deceptive, and possibly unethical, or certainly annoying, right? So Upworthy is, I think, the poster child for clickbait. The journalist friends that I have mentioned that there's a lot of pressure to get videos with their stories, whether it's the stupid little shot of a fire hydrant going up or the clip that was shown earlier of pointing out tanks and helicopters. These things get eyeballs, so there's pressure to stay on top of videos, pressure to stay on top of Twitter. These technologies can help with a story, but I'm wondering now, I mean, does this mean an unreasonable workload for the journalists to stay on top of all these bases? Peter King talked about Jim Hayes' incredible work ethic. You know, what about now? You gotta stay, not only do that, read books about nuclear power, but you gotta stay on top of social media and you gotta get videos of things. So, yeah, new journalists need to do it all, and it's a tall order. I'm worried about this. So publishers may be helped by the rise of citizen journalists and academic journalists like me. It's free labor for them, right? They don't pay me usually, so that helps with the financial pressure. But I worry about professional journalists who actually make a living doing this. Am I taking away money from them? Does this mean less work for them? Maybe yes or maybe no, and this is enabled by technology. And all this technology-fueled pressure on revenues, I think, starts to bring out the tension between profit and the pursuit of truth more starkly. So this feels almost like the shady pharmaceutical industry where the profit motive collides with the healthcare motive, and and bad things happen. And I think journalism wants to avoid this association. So some closing thoughts to tie it all together. Here's one possible way I think the journalism industry might implode, okay? One dystopian look. There are lower barriers to publish, that's clear, right? Any idiot can throw up a website or make a blog post. And this means declining revenue for traditional journalists, and Craigslist and others aren't helping. And some publishers have gone by the wayside and others may follow. I think what this means is that, I mean, news isn't going to disappear, but it's just going to be pushed out more on the little tribes and the little campfires, right, to the individuals. So news is going to be more democratized. But that also means that standards may start to disappear. If standards disappear, then trust disappears as well. And to quote Bill Murray in Ghostbusters, if this happens, then dogs and cats might be living together and there's mass hysteria. All bets are off if this happens. And the media plays such an important role in not just government watchdogging, but in educated public. We can make sound decisions on economic policy, education policy, defense policy. I don't know how this is all going to play out. I mean, this is an evolving story. But I want to challenge you and the previous speakers that it's possible that values may change with time, and that's okay. Changes inevitable anyway. But look at how some of our values have evolved in the last few decades. 1940s, the greatest generation has ever lived. Hard work, white picket fences. 1960s was about freedom and experimentation. 1980s, greed was good. 1990s, I don't know what they were, maybe like a grunge wonderland or something. 2000s, we were still hungover from the dot-com bust, and in recent history, it's probably too early to tell. But times evolve, standards evolve. That might be okay. Let me give you one example of evolving ethics in another field I work with, which is military systems and law and policy. So imagine this scenario. Imagine you're in war, and we've developed a perfectly harmless knockout gas. Okay, not the knockout gas they used in the Moscow theater, several years ago, but this one that actually doesn't kill hostages. Imagine there's a hostage situation. You have terrorists mixed with hostages in some room, and we have a perfectly harmless knockout gas that knocks everyone out for, say, 30 minutes. If we use it, we could, knock everyone out, everyone's sleeping peacefully, and just get the bad guys and tie them up and arrest them, send them to Guantanamo. I don't know what you do with them. Is that ethical? Should we do that? How many people think that we should not use a knockout gas? We should do something else, like storm the theater, storm the room, and maybe take some losses. How many people think that it's okay to use this knockout gas? Can I get a raised show of hands? Some of you. How many people think it's not okay to use this knockout gas? Some of you. Well, it happens that the law will tell you that it is not okay to use this, because there's something called the Chemical Weapons Convention that bans the use of tear gas and other chemicals in war. You can use it in law enforcement, but not in war. And in the laws of war, there's something called the principle of discrimination, which is that you should never, ever target non-combatants. This is sacrosanct. It's inviolable. You should never target non-combatants, mostly means civilians. You can accidentally kill them, right? They could be collateral damage if they happen to be nearby, but you can never deliberately target them. With a knockout gas, that seems to be exactly what we're doing. You're targeting everybody to get knocked out. So the only point here is that it seems reasonable to a lot of people that you can use this knockout gas, yet it's currently illegal, right? And so that legal norm, it's not a ridiculous question or a ridiculous suggestion to say that maybe our legal norms might need to evolve or adjust to the new realities of technology. And I think something like that could be said about journalism. That's the provoking anger part, I think. So there are other models to arrive at the truth. This isn't the only one. We could look at, for instance, the American legal system, which is an adversarial system, right? You have the plaintiff's attorney, you have the defense counsel. In American law, we think that justice is best served when all parties are represented. They're jealously represented. If there's a free market of ideas, and the hope is that the best idea is going to win. And there's still ethics in this process. There's safeguards. So I want to suggest that there's another way we can get truth. Good intention, honest reporting can still have blind spots and hidden biases, which may be inescapable. Is this less likely to be truth promoting than an adversarial process like we have in law? I don't know. But again, my point is that it's not ridiculous to think that there might be other ways to arrive at the truth, whatever that may be. So let me try to tie all these three themes back together. So regarding identity, I would think that ethics is a very big competitive advantage for legitimate media. It helps us separate the signal from the noise. It helps to promote trust. Of course, the problem is if ethics is invisible to the readers, if they can't distinguish you from bloggers, from platforms, whatever, then it's not going to be much of a benefit. So one possible solution here is that there's an identity crisis, and I don't know, maybe the journalism industry can benefit from a public affairs or a PR or a branding campaign to make it known, here we are, we're core journalists, and we're beholden to this higher standard of truth. We're truth seekers, and everyone else is not. Maybe that's a competitive advantage. So remember, trust is one of your best assets. Back to truth, if objectivity is a fiction, then maybe we could be more creative with how we tell a story and still be ethical. Again, as Karen and others pointed out, there's more than one way to tell a story. You could differentiate yourself with authenticity, voice, creativity. You could even be biased and partisan and polemic and emotional, and that might be okay. But if it is okay, then we have to understand that our commitment to truth is more complicated than advertised by these code of ethics. Some people have done away with the comment section. They want to make that less of a circus. That might work. That might work for them and might work for others. And finally, about money, financial pressure is the key domino, I think, that could set off this downward slide into dogs and cats living together. And pressure can cause cost-saving measures, such as not replacing reporters or hiring or buying robot reporters. And I think you should think carefully about that. It could work for you, or maybe it could backfire. But I think there's a bigger picture here, which is that automation might turn your publication into a commodity. And that game is won on price. So I think you need to ask yourself, do we want to play that game? As Peter King pointed out earlier, I mean, it's not a bad idea to be skeptical of technology. I work with technology. I'm a fan of technology. But nonetheless, spell check can be wrong. Right? So there are limitations to robot reporters also. Change is coming, and Karen and others have mentioned this. And resistance could be futile, but change can be managed. And I think keeping grounded in ethics is important if you want to keep media as a trustworthy source of news and a government watchdog. Ethics is important because trust is important, to separate the signal from the noise again. If the readers can't do that, if they can't tell good, honest information from bad, then that's a problem for an educated democracy. If you give up on ethics, and that's a real decision point, then all bets are off. This industry could look radically different. And I think some people might like that, right? Some people are pushing us in that direction. But I think traditional media can't win that war. They can't win a total war where anything goes, because you're competing against throngs of technology-enabled competitors who might already be playing without those rules. So if you abandon ethics, then they win. So I think as this day has shown us, ethics matters now more than ever. So that's it.